Next, I'd like to introduce our guest presenter. Amanda Helin is a member of the Gardens and Grounds team at the U.S. Botanic Garden. With a background in plant biology, her career path has gone from scientist to organic farmer to gardener. Before joining the U.S. Botanic Garden, she spent 4 years as head gardener for Riversdale House Museum in Maryland, where she ran a half-acre kitchen garden. Outside of work, Amanda also gardens at home. Though she'll tell you that between her work at the USBG and her 2 kids, her home garden gets much less attention than it deserves. I don't believe it. I'm sure it looks fantastic. But welcome, Amanda.
Thank you.
Thanks for taking the time to join us. We're excited to hear from you about some important things to be thinking about in the vegetable garden now that it's April. Last month when we talked with Thomas, he showed us some cool season crops indoors at the production facility. So I wondered if we could start out just talking a little about cool season crops and what people might want to be thinking about at this point in the season.
Yeah, so cool season crops, and what we're talking about there are things that can survive some freezing temperatures, but also things that really like to grow when it's cooler out. It can be a little bit tricky to grow them here in the Mid-Atlantic because it gets so very hot in Washington, D.C. in the summertime. So a lot of things that we really want to get out of our garden and really want to eat, like lettuce and spinach and cabbage, are not, well, I was going to say they're not very happy growing in hot weather. But really what happens is they mature very quickly and they go to seed. And during that part of their life cycle, they're not nearly as delicious. They start producing chemical compounds that make them more bitter and protect their new seeds, their offspring, from things eating them, like us, I guess. So cool season crops, the things that got shown last month when Thomas gave one of these, many of them have been transplanted out into the garden at this point. So yeah, he particularly things that take a little bit longer, like cabbage. If you're in this area of the country, you're really going to want to have gotten those out there by now. And there's a great picture. I think there's green cabbage straight ahead, and then over to the right there's some red cabbage past the daffodils. I think we had another picture. Yeah, so this one, all the plants are really quite small this time of year, so it's not particularly dramatic garden. It's very nicely mulched with pine straw at this point to suppress weeds, but also I think to hide the irrigation tape from viewers. And in this picture, we've got over in the foreground here some perennial things that are in the kitchen garden, which this really early spring is when you're going to really appreciate having those perennials, because they're going to be there and ready to harvest this time of year when not very much else is. So there are some herbs, I think sage, but maybe rosemary and thyme would also be wonderful things, as well as garden sorrel. I really love to have this time of year. Yeah, the green that you'd be able to pick. And of course, asparagus is something else you'd be able to harvest this time of year. Oh, and the garlic. That picture had garlic in it, which I want to say something about the garlic, because I love growing garlic, partially because its season runs opposite most of the things in the garden. You plant it in the fall and you harvest it in the spring. So that's a nice change, but also it's delicious and beautiful plants.
Agreed. Thank you. And then what about warm season crops? Because we're approaching the time that we're going to transition from cool to warm. Can you talk a little bit about what should be happening now with people's warm season crops?
So maybe you've started some inside at this point. Not here, it's not too late yet to start, say, some tomatoes and peppers indoors. What makes these warm season crops is that most of them, for one thing, cannot survive freezing temperatures. So you really can't put them out until after you are out of the woods there, as far as a frost. But also, they really grow well when it's hot out. So in addition to waiting until you're no longer likely to have a frost, you may want to wait just a little bit longer. Sometimes seed packets call it, put them out when the weather is warm and settled, which is maybe a little bit after your last frost date. Because if you put your tomatoes or peppers or cucumbers out into the garden when it's still quite cool, even if they don't freeze to death, they may just sort of sit there.
Great. And we have a link that we can share for people who want to look up their last frost date, so you have a sense of that. The last thing I wanted to check with you about before we get started with people's questions is the topic of weeds, because I know that you're very passionate about managing weeds at this time of year. So can you talk a little bit about what people can be doing to kind of set themselves up for success in terms of staying ahead of weeds in their vegetable gardens? And I'm going to share a few weed images that you sent to me so you can kind of talk through them.
Yeah, so a couple different things about weeds this time of year. There are, here in the Mid-Atlantic, we've got a wide variety of cool season weeds, which germinated in the fall or last summer and are now flowering and getting ready to go to seed. And if you have any of those in your vegetable garden, you really need to get rid of them right now before they go to seed. In this picture, we've got hairy bittercress, which with flowers on it, and in the background, chickweed. Both of those happen to be edible weeds. And bittercress actually is one of the few weeds that I would recommend anybody eating just because it tastes good and spicy. But it's also a fun plant. When it goes to seed, it has what's called ballistic dispersal, which is fun from a botany point of view, but not great from a vegetable gardening point of view, in that once the seeds have set and the little pods dry, any light touch of them will make them spring across the garden like several feet all over the place. So these are going to seed, or at least flowering at this time of year, and make sure you get rid of them so that you don't have that problem in the future. They say 1 year seeding, 7 years weeding. So use that as motivation. Then that's a pineapple weed, giving you a little sample of some of the cool season weeds we have to remove. And there's the hairy bittercress again. Cool looking little plant. Better to pick it early, like in December or something like that. Then it makes a really great salad green. So the other thing that you want to watch out with weeds this time of year is that the soil's starting to warm up a bit and things are going to germinate. And if you're new to gardening, it's really easy to not pay attention to those very small seedling weeds. But it really does behoove you to get rid of them now, because they're really easy to kill now, and then you don't have to worry about them so much later. You can get rid of some of the seed bank in there. If you have a relatively bare soil like this, you can just scrape the very top layer of the soil. They call seedlings at this stage the white thread stage, because they just have a tiny little root stem that looks like a white thread. And if you use a tool like a hand hoe or a soil knife I have here, just to lightly scrape it, you don't even need to remove them from the garden. You just disturb the soil enough that they get dried out and die. And that will put you ahead of things for later in the season.
Great, thank you. At this point, I invite people to keep submitting your questions. We've had a bunch come in already, but I'll kind of turn over now to asking you questions that people have been submitting and will continue to submit throughout the rest of the program. The first kind of topic is there were a few questions that came about warm season crops. Somebody asked about looking for tips for natural pest control for tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers. Last year, it seemed their cucumbers didn't do well. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Cucumbers can be tricky. There are a lot of fungal and viral pathogens that will affect cucumbers in this area particularly. And by and large, they're spread by insects that come and nibble on the plant, which the insect won't do a huge amount of damage in and of itself, but it'll then spread a cucumber wilt of some kind. And I've many times had cucumber plants just all of a sudden dead. The best way to protect them, if you want to do it organically, is by physical exclusion. Which is to say, you put a row cover over your cucumber plants, or them being in a greenhouse is really helpful to them too. In my experience, that is really the best way to keep particularly cucumber beetles off of them. But don't feel discouraged. It can be hard.
I have another interesting insect-related question. Will the cicadas eat upcoming vegetable plants? We have the cicadas coming.
No, is my understanding. I'm trying to remember what the adult cicadas eat, but they don't eat a lot. They have been underground nibbling on tree roots for 17 years. And then by the time they're adults, I don't think they're not really in a stage of their life where they're eating a lot. I didn't answer the question about tomatoes and pathogens, which we go back to that.
Yeah, go ahead. Yep.
Everybody's going to be growing tomatoes. And they're also pretty tricky in this area because everybody grows tomatoes, and there are a huge number of pathogens that are spread from the soil or airborne, funguses and viruses, and the humidity here really doesn't help tomatoes out at all. They do much better if, again, if you're looking at organic means. One of the best things you can do is trellis them and prune them well so that they have a lot of airflow. I'm sure there are lots of resources online where you can find out how to prune a tomato, but the way tomato plants naturally grow, they have lots and lots of little stalks from near the base, and they will vine all over the ground. But really what you want to do in the garden to get your best yield of tomatoes is to prune them down to probably 1 or 2 main stems and take the runners off the sides. And you'll get earlier tomatoes that way, and also it'll really help you get ahead of fungal pathogens. And if you're really having trouble still with like early blight, you can spray them with copper sulfate, which is an organically approved fungicide. And you have to do that fairly regularly. But really the best thing is to have healthy plants, healthy soil. That'll help you out.
Thanks. And I'm glad you mentioned trellising. I think next month when we do one of these, I think Craig will do it, and he was interested to talk about trellising. So more to come on that. Another kind of tomato related question. Someone was asking about the best way to rotate nightshade family veggies and they're working in a raised bed, a 4x15 raised bed in our zone.
It's difficult to do really solid crop rotation in a small garden. What I do at my house, where I really vegetable wise only grow a few things, is I try to put my tomatoes in different places each year. So yeah, so nightshade, the nightshade family includes tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, and if you can, don't plant them in the same place 2 years in a row. Most of the pathogens that you're going to be worried about with those are soil borne, and you can help that out to some degree by using a mulch that is going to keep the soil from splashing onto the leaves of the plants when it rains. But yeah, I mean, if you've got a 4x15 garden, you want to make a plan so that what I would do is sort of keep all the nightshades together and then move them to a different side the next year. Or you can do sort of 2 years in a row and then move them for another 2 years to the other side. It's a very reasonable way to go as well.
Another location related question. Someone was asking if they can still grow tomatoes if they have an area that's mostly shade, or if there are other vegetables that would work well in a shady space.
Yeah, that's one of the hardest things for home gardeners is finding a really sunny spot. Like if you look at a market garden or commercial agriculture, it is full sun, all the sun, and that unfortunately most vegetables are really adapted to needing all that sun to really produce. Tomatoes are not going to do well in a shady location, I'm sorry to say. If you can like muster one tomato in a big pot in a sunny space, you can actually get a lot out of that. I've seen people like put one in their driveway because that's where there's no shade. There are things you can grow in a relatively shady spaces. I mean, if we're talking about like full shade, horticulture wise, you're going to have trouble. But the vegetable crops that would do best are things, you can think of it as things that you're going to eat the leaves of. So lettuce, having shade actually will help you bring lettuce through a hot summer. But yeah, lettuce, spinach, kale, anything where it's the plant itself. You can get some beans too to grow in the shade to some degree. Yeah, but tomatoes are on the other end, needing sun.
Yeah, and you mentioned growing tomatoes in pots. Someone was asking for recommendations about that. And then relatedly, someone was asking about growing tomatoes in grow bags and asking about the best soil to use and the best way to clean the bags after the growing season. Could you talk about
yeah, so growing tomatoes in containers. The thing that you need to remember about containers is that they are going to dry out and need more attention than something that's growing in the ground. I wouldn't put a tomato in anything smaller than a 5-gallon bucket. As a rule of thumb, the bigger the pot, the better it's going to work for basically anything. So yeah, let's see. And then soil, there are plenty of perfectly good potting soils out there commercially available that make that work well for container use. I like to have a soil that's got some compost in it that has some, which is more likely to have some biological activity rather than just being straight peat moss. But yeah, you also need to be sure that you're keeping an eye on giving your plants fertilizer if they're in a pot as well, because it is like it's a less natural system, and you're going to want to fertilize your garden anyway. But if you have great garden soil that you've developed over years, then that's going to be less of an issue than if you have pot. I guess I'd also put a plug in for self-watering pots, because it is so difficult to keep a pot watered, at least in my experience. When I never seem to manage to have time to do that sort of thing at my own home after doing it all day at work. But there are a number of products and also instructions for making them on your own for pots that have a reservoir of water in the bottom and a wick that brings the water up to the roots of the plants, and that can be a really big time saver. Grow bags are similar to pots. I haven't done a lot of growing in grow bags myself. I can see how cleaning them would be a problem. I kind of wonder, this is total speculation right here, but I bet you could clean them insofar as you're like killing the sort of soil-borne pathogens from the roots that maybe have gotten enmeshed in the fabric by some sort of solarization, like putting them under some plastic, clear plastic or black plastic, where they're going to heat up a lot. If you're not able to like really clean them well, because I can see how I think they're not necessarily meant to be used more than once by the manufacturer.
Got it. Switching gears a little bit, you talked a little bit about soil. Somebody was asking, just kind of at this point in the season, how could they improve their garden soil? Do you want to speak about that a little bit?
Sure. So I would always recommend having a soil test. It's an easy thing to do, and there's really nothing better than having accurate information. And you're going to want to find a soil test where you're going to be sending a little sample of your garden soil to a lab. Like the most states' extension services have good information on that. And it's not a big deal. It's like something like $10 kind of a investment. And that will usually you be able to say, this is for a vegetable garden. And then they will actually give you recommendations of like how much nitrogen you should apply over the course of the year. And then you can buy fertilizer in that quantity and give it to your plants. As far as improving the soil, the structure of the soil and the tilth, adding compost is a really great thing to do. It's hard to go wrong with adding like an inch of compost over your garden. And then if you have really heavy soil, you're going to really want to work it in as much as you can. You need to be very careful not to do it when the soil is very wet, because that can, working it when it's quite wet can destroy soil structure. But then it also can't be too dry either. So there you go. But I'm a big fan of using what's called a broad fork in when I'm gardening, rather than rather than like a rototiller, which really grinds the soil up. I like to use a broad fork, which just you put it in, push it into the soil, and it kind of lifts everything up a little bit, so that it loosens things up. It doesn't make it like quite as pretty and flat as a bed looks right after you've rototilled it, but I think it in the long run is much better for the plant.
Thanks. And then there were questions about raised beds and soil. Someone said they bought 2 raised beds to grow vegetables in their backyard. What's the best type of soil that they should add to it? They said their existing soil is terrible.
Yeah, I have terrible soil at my house as well. It can be a little bit tricky to get a good source of what landscapers will call topsoil. Usually what it is some sort of native soil from, wherever, then mixed with compost. If you can get and budget's going to come in here. Like if you could buy, potting soil and compost and many bags of that and fill up your beds, that'd be great. There are plenty of potting soil mixes that would work just great for that. If you really have a large volume, you're going to need to you're going to need to spend some money on it if you want it brought in from someone else. And you're going to want to get as much information from them as you can about what it is that is in the soil. You can add a lot of compost and organic matter that is more freely available and dig it into your bad soil and improve it over time. But if you're looking for like immediately having a great garden, you're going to end up spending some money on the soil.
Makes sense. Thanks. We have a bunch of questions about pests. You ready for some pest related questions?
Sure. I can.
Somebody asked about controlling rodents, preferably in a natural and humane way without using pesticides. Any thoughts on
that? Cats. Controlling rodents. Well, are we talking about in the city? Maybe.
Especially rats. So I think yes.
Especially rats. Yeah. That can be an unpleasant problem in a city garden. I would take care to not leave a lot of debris around to begin with. As far as control, it's going to be the same sort of control that you would use for rats anywhere, where you're gonna need to decide what kind of trapping you're comfortable with. And the other thing, that can be a huge problem in gardens in general. Like I'm thinking also squirrels or rabbits or other animals are very hard to deal with, and often really the only foolproof way to do it is physical exclusion, meaning a fence, or if you have a small garden, building some kind of a cage around it, which can also kind of double as trellising, and it's a little difficult to make pretty. But if you really want to keep wildlife or pests, mammal pests out of your garden, that's kind of the way you have to go.
Yeah, and we had a question specifically about the physical exclusion. Somebody said that they noticed the chicken wire that they've used to keep rabbits out has a lead warning. And they're asking about how significant is the risk. What are some non-lead and hopefully non-plastic barriers that they could consider using?
Hmm. I would be a little, well, I don't know. I would be a little bit surprised if it would have enough lead in it to like leach into the soil or something like that. I can see how that would be disconcerting though for something that you were going to have to handle on a regular basis. Um, I don't know enough about those materials to be able to really give a good answer on that one, I'm afraid.
Okay, maybe other people in the chat have things that they've used before that they want to recommend.
Or maybe there's chicken wire that isn't produced with lead. I've used hardware cloth, but I don't know enough about the composition of it to really give you a good
Okay, fair enough. We have some insect questions. Somebody asked, they have a lot of ants in their new community garden plot, and they're wondering, will the ants harm the plants or seeds? And if so, what would you recommend?
I wouldn't worry too much about ants. They, I feel like are mostly a nuisance to the gardener. Like if you end up digging them up, they'll bite you. But I don't think typically they're going to be a big problem. If you, when you're planting, you end up disturbing their hill, maybe they'll move. But they're not generally considered a big problem.
And same question about potato bugs or pill bugs in the soil. Are they harmless, or would they be a threat to people's vegetables?
Like roly polies, is that what that
I
means?
think so, yeah.
Are not. No, they wouldn't really. They're not typically a problem.
Okay. We have one question about flea beetles. They asked, especially dealing with their eggplants, flea beetles are a challenge and they destroy the plants that they've planted in the past. Any suggestions for dealing with them?
Yeah, the greatest success I've had with eggplants not having flea beetles problems has been with, I want to say companion planting, but that kind of implies that there's like one other plant I'm going to suggest planting them with. But when the Riversdale House Museum, which is where I kept the kitchen garden for 4 years, was planted in a style that reflected the early 1800s, where there were flowers and ornamental plantings that were really mixed with the vegetables. And I would have, I don't know, like 10 square feet of mixed flowers with, a bed that was like 4x10 of eggplant in the middle. And the eggplant loved it. There were no flea beetles. It was amazing. And I can't tell you precisely what it was that was living in the flowers that was eating the flea beetles, but that's if you can do that, it's pretty good. The other thing, again, physical exclusion. Flea beetles are pretty hard to control with any kind of spray. But if you put row covers on your plants, that will do it. That can get to be a problem with eggplants. I've used row covers on arugula, which gets a lot of that like shot hole damage from flea beetles, and that works pretty well. Eggplants do want to be pollinated, which makes it tricky with the row covers. But if you give them a really good head start, that can help a lot too. You have healthy plants.
Thanks. Um, a question about sequential cropping and intercropping. Can you give any advice on that sequential cropping and intercropping between seasons?
Takes a lot of planning to do that really well. If I mean, I yeah, if you really want to make the most of the space you have a small garden, um, there are a lot of things you can do, and you want to think it through um, early in the season. I mean, you can really run into an issue where if you um, we were talking about warm season and cool season crops and the transition there. If you plant everything in lettuce um, or everything in broccoli, then you the broccoli is maybe not ready when you want to put in your tomatoes. So there's just some planning there. There are some things you can do on a small garden scale um, that do are nice, are a good satisfying way to extend the season. Like you can plant, let's say, um, you can plant things in rows much closer to one another, where one of the crops, like let's say radishes, which only take a month practically before you can harvest them, are next to carrots, which are going to be a lot longer, more like 3 months. And so you can plant them together, quite close together, and then when the radishes are ready, pull out all the radishes and eat them. And the carrots have more space then once those plants are getting larger. And you can do that to some degree with things that you're starting at different times as well. If you have a row of carrots, say, that are going to be coming out, you can plant something that's going to need that space near them, which then once the carrots come out, they get more space. Yeah, it can be tricky.
Great. Thank you. So we're just about at the end of our time. Wanted to ask you one last question. A lot of people have been talking about their home gardens, so I wondered about your home garden. Do you have something new that you and your family are planning to try out or experiment with this year in your vegetable garden at home?
Well, I'm actually trying to expand my vegetable garden a little bit because it's negligible. Um, but and mostly, I think what we'll end up doing this spring is I'll be planting some seeds in the garden soon with my daughter, who is 9 and who is homeschooling this year because of the pandemic. So it's going to probably be pretty much whatever she wants to plant. um, but also the couple of things that I'm excited about doing this year in my at my house are putting in a fig tree and putting in a pie cherry tree, which those are both things that you really can't get otherwise. So I'm excited to
Those
put
sound
those
like,
in, and it'll
yeah,
take a few years before I get any.
those sound like great things to have in your yard and have access to all the time. That would be really cool. Thanks so much, Amanda, for sharing your time and your expertise with us today. And thanks to all of our participants for your great questions and taking some time out of your day to join us.